brides of Rattlesnake Canyon, the Cheyenne sisters who devoured men in the Texas wilds, 1875. The dry wind of Texas rattled through the hills of Rattlesnake Canyon. The sun rose early and fell late, casting long shadows over the rugged rocks and sparse trees. The land was wild, untamed, and dangerous for anyone who did not know its ways. But it was also a place of opportunity, where those who were brave or desperate could make a life for themselves. Two sisters, Lela and Maris, had arrived at the canyon with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a few small belongings carefully wrapped in cloth. They were of Cheyenne heritage, though their journey had taken them far from the plains of their ancestors. The sisters were quiet, careful, and observant, moving as if they belonged to the hills themselves. They had come seeking a place to escape the violence and troubles of the world beyond the canyon. The Red River conflicts had left scars on their people, and both sisters had learned early that trust was rare and survival was a skill. Rattlesnake Canyon was not an easy place to live. Water was scarce, except in a few hidden pools along the creek that wound through the canyon floor. Game was limited, and snakes, wolves, and other wild animals were constant threats. Yet Lela and Maris were determined. They set to work immediately, clearing a small area near the creek and building a modest cabin from the fallen trees and stones that the canyon generously provided. It was rough at first, uneven walls and a roof that leaked when it rained, but it was shelter, and that was enough. The sisters were careful to keep themselves hidden from the occasional travelers who passed through the canyon. Most people avoided the area, fearing rattlesnakes, harsh terrain, and stories of wild outlaws hiding in the hills. But the curious, or the reckless, sometimes came, hoping for shelter, company, or story. Lela and Maris welcomed these visitors with polite smiles. Though they were always cautious, they learned quickly how to read people, to notice the slight shifts in a man's gaze or the nervous twitch of his hand. Years of experience taught them that the world was full of danger, not just from nature, but from those who walked on two legs. Life in the canyon was difficult, but the sisters adapted quickly. They learned which plants were safe to eat and which would make them sick. They hunted small game, rabbits, squirrels, and the occasional deer, with skill and patience. At night they lit small fires near their cabin and told each other stories, some from their childhood, some from the history of their people. They laughed sometimes, though it was a quiet, private laughter, never loud enough to carry beyond the trees. The canyon became both their refuge and their teacher, showing them how to live in harmony with the land while remaining alert to its dangers. Despite their reclusive life, the sisters could not escape notice entirely. Travelers and settlers occasionally passed near the canyon and would sometimes catch a glimpse of them working near the cabin or walking along the creek. Their presence sparked curiosity. They were striking in appearance, with dark hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. Some who saw them whispered to themselves, wondering who these women were and why they lived alone in such a harsh place. Others dismissed the sightings as a trick of the sun and shadow, but over time, stories began to spread. People spoke of the sisters in hushed tones, calling them mysterious, even enchanting. The sisters, however, paid little attention to the rumors. They focused on survival and the routines they had created. Lela rose early each day, drawing water from the creek and tending to their small garden of herbs and vegetables. Maris would prepare meals, clean the cabin, and keep watch over the surrounding land. Both sisters spent hours learning the movements of animals and the patterns of the weather. They studied the land as if it were a living book, and each day they added new knowledge to the pages of their experience. It was not just survival that kept them busy, however. The sisters were also aware that humans, men especially, were unpredictable and sometimes dangerous. Over the years, they had learned caution, the kind of instinct that made them notice when a stranger's eyes lingered too long or when a voice carried a hint of dishonesty. And yet, they also knew how to use kindness, charm, and intelligence to protect themselves. People often let their guard down around them, seeing only friendly women in need of companionship, unaware of the careful watchfulness behind the smiles. The canyon was beautiful in its own harsh way. Cliff faces rose like walls, dotted with cacti and scrub trees. In the mornings, mist from the creek hung low, curling around rocks and fallen logs. Birds of many colors darted through the branches, calling out to each other. Deer moved silently through the shadows, and at night the sky stretched endlessly, filled with stars that seemed brighter than anywhere else. For the sisters, the canyon was more than just a place to hide. It was a sanctuary, a place where the world outside could not touch them. But life in Rattlesnake Canyon was not without tension. Even in the quietest moments, there was always the possibility of danger. A sudden rattlesnake strike, a hidden cliff edge, or an unexpected traveler could change everything. Lala and Maris learned to trust their instincts above all else. They moved with caution, spoke sparingly to strangers, and never let themselves be caught unaware. In this way, the canyon taught them lessons about patience, observation, and the importance of self-reliance. Occasionally, men did wander into the canyon, drawn by rumors of a hidden water source or the stories that whispered of two women living alone in the hills. Some were simple travelers, others traders or hunters looking for a place to rest. Lala and Maris greeted them with polite smiles, offered food and warmth, and listened to their stories. The sisters' intelligence and presence commanded respect, and few could leave without noticing that these were not ordinary women. There was a quiet strength about them, a sense that they were in full control of their surroundings. By the end of the first summer, the sisters' life in Rattlesnake Canyon had settled into a rhythm. Each day was a balance of work, observation, and preparation. Each night was a time for reflection, for sharing memories, and for reinforcing the unspoken bond between them. They had found a measure of safety in the wilds, and in the solitude, they had also found a sense of freedom. Yet beneath the surface of this freedom lay a careful calculation, a constant awareness that the world beyond the canyon could intrude at any moment. The summer of 1875 was the beginning of a story that would ripple far beyond the canyon walls. It was the start of a chapter that would mix survival, intelligence, and mystery in a way few could understand. For Layla and Maris, Rattlesnake Canyon was both refuge and stage, a place where the harsh realities of life and the quiet power of two determined sisters would shape events that would be remembered long after their footsteps had faded from the canyon floor. As the summer in Rattlesnake Canyon stretched on, Layla and Maris settled into a careful rhythm of life. They had learned to read the signs of the land, the movement of the wind, the tracks of animals, and the subtle changes in the creek that warned of approaching storms. The sisters were cautious but not afraid. They moved with confidence, each step deliberate, each action guided by years of observation and instinct. Yet even in their solitude, the world outside the canyon found ways to reach them. It began with the travelers. A few men, wandering through the hills in search of work, water, or shelter, stumbled across the sisters' cabin. Layla and Maris greeted them politely, offering food, fresh water, and a warm fire. Their voices were calm, their eyes alert, and their manners flawless. There was a quiet charm to the sisters, something that drew people in without them even realizing it. Travelers who arrived expecting nothing more than a place to rest often left with admiration for the sisters' intelligence, skill, and resourcefulness. The sisters had learned early to measure trust carefully. Some men were honest, grateful for the help, and left quietly, leaving no trace. Epidemic. Others were brash, curious about the sisters' life, or too eager to ask questions they had no right to. Lala and Maris had mastered the art of careful conversation. They would smile, answer questions politely, and guide discussions toward safe topics. They never revealed their full knowledge of the land, nor did they allow anyone too close. In this way, they maintained control without appearing unfriendly or suspicious. One late afternoon, a young trader named Silas appeared in the canyon. He was tall, with sandy hair and eyes that reflected curiosity rather than suspicion. Silas had been traveling for days, and the sisters welcomed him to share their fire. That evening he spoke of towns far away, of rivers that stretched beyond the horizon, and of the many people he had met. Lala and Maris listened carefully, asking questions at just the right moments to keep him engaged. Their calm, attentive demeanor made him feel at ease, as if he were speaking to trusted friends rather than strangers in a wild, isolated place. As night fell, the canyon changed. Shadows lengthened, and the wind whispered through the rocks and trees. Lela and Maris moved about with practiced grace, preparing simple meals and tidying the cabin. The sisters had created a life that was as efficient as it was comfortable, though comfort was measured differently here than in the towns or cities. Candles flickered and the fire crackled, casting dancing lights on the walls. The sisters shared stories of their childhood, of the plains where they had once lived, and of the lessons they had learned from their family. Silas listened, captivated by their words and the mysterious strength that seemed to radiate from them. Over the following days, more travelers arrived. Some were hunters, some were wanderers, and some were men seeking temporary shelter from the harsh sun. Lala and Maris treated each guest with kindness, offering food, water, and advice about the canyon. They learned each visitor's habits, listening for hints of honesty or deceit, watching for any sign that might reveal a man's true intentions. The sisters had a way of noticing small details, the way a hand trembled, the way eyes darted, or the way a voice hesitated. These observations allowed them to predict behavior, to prepare, and to protect themselves without alarming anyone. The sisters' presence in the canyon began to draw attention beyond the occasional traveler. Word spread slowly but steadily to nearby towns and ranches about the two women living in the wild hills. People spoke of them with curiosity, fascination, and sometimes suspicion. Who were these sisters? Where had they come from? How did they survive alone in a place as harsh as Rattlesnake Canyon? Some claimed to have seen them walking along the cliffs, their dark hair flowing in the wind, their figures moving with a grace that seemed almost unnatural. Others said they had heard laughter in the night, soft and melodic, echoing from the canyon walls. Despite the growing stories, Layla and Maris remained cautious. They avoided unnecessary encounters, keeping the cabin hidden from those who might seek it for reasons other than simple curiosity. They understood that not all attention was harmless. Some people were drawn by greed, others by fear, and some by a desire to control what they did not understand. The sisters relied on their knowledge of the land to remain unseen when needed, slipping silently through the trees, hiding in the shadows, and using the canyon's natural features to their advantage. Life in the canyon required constant awareness. The sisters learned to notice patterns in the movements of animals and people alike. They could tell when a storm was approaching, when a herd of deer was nearby, or when a stranger had entered the canyon without announcing themselves. This awareness gave them a sense of security, even in isolation. It also made them appear mysterious to those who saw them from a distance, as if they were part of the land itself, rather than mere visitors. The sisters' bond grew stronger in these days. They relied on each other not just for practical survival, but for companionship and understanding. Layla, the older sister, was calm, deliberate, and cautious, often acting as the planner and observer. Maris, though younger, was quick-witted, adaptable, and skilled in gathering resources from the canyon. Together, they complemented each other perfectly, forming a partnership that was both practical and deeply personal. They shared responsibilities, joys, and worries, each aware that the other's safety was as important as their own. Even with their careful routines, the sisters were aware that the canyon held its own challenges. Animals could be unpredictable. Fires could start without warning. Illness or injury could strike at any moment, and there was no nearby town or doctor to provide help. Yet these challenges were also opportunities. The sisters used every experience as a lesson, strengthening their skills and deepening their understanding of the world around them. By observing, experimenting, and learning, they transformed the harshness of the canyon into a teacher rather than an enemy. As the summer progressed, the sisters began to notice patterns in the men who entered their domain. Some were respectful, curious, or gentle. Others were arrogant, careless, or easily frustrated by the unfamiliar surroundings. Layla and Maris treated each visitor according to these observations, using discretion and tact to maintain control of the situation. They had learned that appearances could be deceiving, and that understanding human behavior required patience, attention, and intelligence. The sisters' days passed in a careful balance of work, observation, and quiet reflection. The canyon offered them solitude and safety, but it also demanded constant awareness and adaptability. They moved through each day with precision and purpose, always mindful of the potential dangers of both the land and the people who passed through it. Their lives were simple, yet full of challenges that tested their skills, resilience, and intelligence. By the end of the summer, the sisters had created a life that was both stable and mysterious. Their presence in Rattlesnake Canyon had become a small legend in itself, a story whispered among travelers and settlers who passed through the hills. People spoke of the two women who lived alone in the wilds, surviving with skill and grace, their movements as natural as the wind and the water. Layla and Maris had become part of the canyon, inseparable from its cliffs, streams, and shadows, yet always alert, always in control, and always ready for whatever challenges might come. The summer of 1875 left the sisters stronger, wiser, and more attuned to the rhythms of the wilds. They had learned that life in Rattlesnake Canyon was not only about survival, but also about understanding the land, the animals, and the people who crossed their path. Their charm, intelligence, and careful observation ensured that they could protect themselves and their home while continuing to live freely and independently. The canyon had become more than a refuge. It had become a classroom, a sanctuary, and a stage on which the sisters would continue to shape their lives and the stories of those who entered their world. As the autumn of 1875 approached, Rattlesnake Canyon began to change. The intense summer heat softened into cooler mornings, and the air carried a crispness that hinted at the coming winter. Leaves on the sparse trees shifted from green to muted shades of yellow and brown, and the wind began to whistle differently through the cliffs and rocks. For Layla and Maris, this was a season of preparation. They needed to gather enough supplies and firewood to endure the colder months, as life in the canyon would become harsher with each passing day. The sisters moved with their usual precision. Layla would climb to the higher ledges to scout for deer tracks or notice signs of approaching storms, while Maris collected firewood and foraged for nuts and berries. Their cabin, once rough and simple, was now neat and well-kept. They had expanded their small garden near the creek, ensuring they would have fresh herbs and vegetables even as the weather grew colder. Their daily life was a balance of survival and observation, routine and vigilance. It was during this time that strangers began arriving more frequently in the canyon. The rumor of two women living alone in the wilds had traveled beyond the hills, drawing curiosity from travelers, traders, and occasional hunters. Most came seeking nothing more than shelter or guidance, and the sisters welcomed them with their usual charm. Yet among the visitors were those who carried subtle hints of arrogance or ignorance, unaware that the sisters were observant and highly capable. Layla and Maris watched carefully, taking mental notes of each person who passed through, understanding that the canyon was not just a home, but a stage where every action mattered. One evening, a trader named Silas returned unexpectedly. He had visited the sisters weeks earlier and had been deeply impressed by their resourcefulness and calm manner. Now he claimed to have lost his way while searching for a shortcut through the hills. Layla and Maris offered him shelter without hesitation, preparing a modest meal and guiding him to a warm spot near the fire. As they spoke, Silas told them stories of towns far to the east, of rivers that seemed endless, and of roads crowded with people and horses. He spoke freely, unaware of how closely the sisters observed him. The way his eyes wandered, the nervous tapping of his fingers, the hesitation in his voice when he mentioned his travels. The sisters had learned long ago that every visitor could teach them something about human behavior. They noticed patterns in speech, gestures, and expressions, using this knowledge to understand whether a person was trustworthy, cautious, or careless. Silas seemed harmless, genuinely lost and polite, yet Layla and Maris still treated him with quiet caution. They were not suspicious without reason, but they understood that a mistake in judgment could have consequences in the wilds, where help was far away and danger often came in unexpected forms. As the days passed, a quiet sense of unease began to settle over the canyon. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. The wind sounded harsher, the shadows lingered longer, and the creeks ran lower than usual. Layla, always alert, noticed the change immediately. She could sense that something in the canyon was shifting, though she could not name what it was. Maris, too, felt it. There was a tension in the air, a sense that the rhythm of their life had been interrupted. They became more deliberate in their actions, taking extra care when venturing outside the cabin or exploring the canyon's edges. One morning, the sisters discovered a new footprint near the creek. It was fresh and unlike any they had seen before. It belonged to a man, but the pattern of his boots suggested someone unfamiliar with the canyon. Layla and Maris examined it carefully, noting the size, depth, and direction. Whoever had been there had walked close enough to the creek to observe the cabin but had not approached the structure directly. This discovery heightened their awareness. The sisters understood that someone was watching them, and they were determined to remain in control of the situation. In the following days, more signs appeared. Bits of cloth snagged on branches, unusual disturbances in the underbrush, and fleeting shadows that disappeared when approached. The sisters did not panic, but they did adjust their routines. Layla began to scout more frequently, moving silently through the higher rocks and keeping a close eye on the canyon's entrances. Maris focused on securing the cabin and making sure that every tool, every supply, and every corner of their home was in order. They spoke less to visitors, relying on gestures and careful observation to communicate their concerns to each other. Despite these precautions, life in the canyon continued with its mix of beauty and challenge. Deer grazed quietly in the morning light, birds sang in the trees, and the creek's water sparkled like glass under the sun. The sisters found solace in these moments, recognizing that even in a place filled with uncertainty, there were constants they could rely on. They continued to expand their knowledge of the land, learning which plants were safe, which rocks were stable, and which paths offered both safety and speed. Each day was a lesson, each experience a chance to strengthen their bond and sharpen their instincts. Yet the presence of strangers added a layer of complexity to their lives. One afternoon, a group of hunters passed near the cabin, speaking loudly and laughing without thought for the sisters' solitude. Layla and Maris remained hidden, observing from the edge of the trees. They watched how the men moved, how they treated the land, and how they interacted with each other. The sisters learned not just about survival, but about the psychology of outsiders, how fear, curiosity, and pride influenced behavior. This knowledge became a tool, allowing them to anticipate actions and prepare accordingly. As autumn deepened, the sisters realized that Rattlesnake Canyon was more than a refuge. It was also a place of opportunity. They could learn from the people who passed through, practice their skills, and maintain complete control over their surroundings. Yet they also understood that every visitor brought potential risk. A careless action, a revealing question, or a poorly chosen path could change everything. Lela and Maris were determined to remain vigilant, balancing kindness with caution and freedom with awareness. One chilly evening, as the sun dipped behind the cliffs and cast long shadows across the canyon floor, Silas approached the cabin again. This time he seemed uneasy, as if he sensed the tension that had been building in the canyon. Layla welcomed him, offering warm tea and a place by the fire. Maris prepared a simple meal, her eyes scanning the edges of the trees for signs of movement. The sisters engaged Silas in conversation, drawing him out while maintaining a careful distance. They asked questions about his travels, listened to his stories, and watched his reactions, noting every detail. As the night wore on, the canyon grew quieter. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, and the usual sounds of wildlife faded into the shadows. Lela and Maris exchanged subtle glances, silently confirming that all was in place. They were alert, prepared, and patient, understanding that the events unfolding in the canyon were part of a larger pattern, one that required attention, intelligence, and caution. By the end of the autumn, the sisters had learned much about the men who entered their world. They had observed behavior, noted patterns, and strengthened their understanding of human nature. They had also deepened their connection to Rattlesnake Canyon itself, learning its rhythms, moods, and secrets. The canyon had become a place of both shelter and education, a teacher that rewarded careful observation and punished recklessness. Leela and Maris had become inseparable from it, moving through its shadows, streams, and cliffs with a knowledge and confidence that few could match. The events of autumn 1875 set the stage for what was to come. The canyon, beautiful and dangerous, calm and unpredictable, had shown the sisters both its generosity and its challenges. Lela and Maris had emerged stronger, wiser, and more aware of the world around them. They had learned that survival was not just about physical strength, but about intelligence, observation, and understanding. And as winter approached, bringing colder days and longer nights, the sisters knew that their journey in Rattlesnake Canyon was far from over. There were mysteries yet to unfold, challenges yet to meet, and lessons yet to be learned. The first cold winds of winter swept through Rattlesnake Canyon, carrying a sharp chill that cut through even the thickest layers of clothing. The trees, stripped of most of their leaves, creaked as the gusts passed through their bare branches. The creek, once lively and sparkling, now ran slower, its water colder and darker. Layla and Maris moved carefully through the canyon, preparing for the colder months ahead. Their cabin had been reinforced with extra wood, and their firewood supply was nearly sufficient to last through the harshest nights. But even as they completed their preparations, the sisters sensed a change in the canyon that went beyond the weather. It started with small, almost imperceptible signs. One morning, Lela noticed a faint path near the edge of the creek that had not been there before. The ground was pressed down as though someone, or something, had recently walked across it, yet the steps seemed cautious, deliberate, and careful to avoid leaving obvious tracks. Maris discovered a few branches broken in unusual ways, suggesting that someone had been moving through the underbrush quietly. The sisters shared a glance, their instincts telling them that they were not alone. Not entirely alone. Despite their careful observation, Lala and Maris did not panic. They had faced unknown dangers before, and understood that the key to safety in the wilds was patience, intelligence, and preparation. Over the next few days, they became even more attentive to the subtle changes around them. They noticed footprints, faint sounds, and occasional glimpses of movement in the distance. Whoever, or whatever, was entering the canyon seemed to be observing them as closely as they were observing it. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the canyon walls and shadows stretched across the floor, Layla and Mary sat near their fire, quietly discussing their discoveries. "We are being watched," Layla said softly, her eyes scanning the cliffs beyond their cabin. But not in the way of a stranger looking for trouble. Someone is cautious, careful, almost like they are trying to understand the canyon before moving further. Maris nodded, her hands folded in her lap. It could be another traveler lost in the hills, or maybe someone curious about us. Either way, we cannot let our guard down. We must be prepared for anything. The next morning, the sisters decided to follow one of the faint paths they had discovered. Lela led the way, moving quietly and deliberately, while Maris followed, keeping a close eye on the surrounding rocks and trees. The path led them deeper into the canyon than they had ever ventured before. The cliffs grew taller, the shadows darker, and the air colder. It was as if the canyon itself was testing them, pushing them to rely on their skills and knowledge. After several hours, they reached a small clearing surrounded by high rocks and fallen trees. In the center of the clearing was a collection of carefully arranged stones and twigs, forming a pattern neither sister had seen before. It was not threatening, but it was deliberate and unusual. Someone had taken the time to create it, leaving a mark of presence that was both mysterious and deliberate. Layla crouched to inspect the arrangement, noting the careful placement of each stone and twig. "This is deliberate," she said quietly. "Someone wants to leave a message, or maybe to be noticed." Maris examined the surrounding area. There are no footprints leading away from here. Whoever made this came and left quietly. They know the canyon as well as we do, or they are extremely careful. For the rest of the day, the sisters returned to their cabin with a new awareness. The canyon had shifted from being a refuge to a stage for something unknown. Every movement of the wind, every whisper of branches, and every flicker of light seemed significant. Layla and Maris became more methodical in their routines, moving with even greater caution and observing everything with sharper eyes. Over the next few weeks, more signs appeared. The sisters discovered small items left in unusual places: a smooth stone on the edge of the creek, a feather tucked into a tree branch, and pieces of bark arranged in shapes that suggested someone had been studying the land carefully. None of it was dangerous, yet it was clear that someone was leaving traces intentionally. Layla and Maris realized that this was not random wandering. Someone was communicating through the landscape itself, leaving marks that could only be noticed by careful observers. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the shadows of the cliff stretched across the canyon floor, the sisters saw movement near the far edge of the canyon. A figure emerged slowly from behind the rocks, careful not to make noise. Lela motioned for Maris to stay quiet, and the sisters watched intently. The figure paused, as if aware it had been seen, then disappeared again without a sound. The sisters felt a mixture of curiosity and caution. Whoever it was, they had skill and patience, and they had chosen Rattlesnake Canyon deliberately. Determined to understand the mystery, the sisters spent the next few days observing the canyon from hidden vantage points. They discovered that the figure appeared sporadically, never approaching too closely, but always watching. Layla and Maris began to leave small, intentional signs of their own: a carefully placed stone near the creek, a stick arranged in a pattern visible from a distance, to see if the figure would notice. Slowly, a silent communication developed. Both sides seemed to be testing the other, using the canyon as a language. This unusual interaction brought a new sense of excitement to the sisters' lives. The canyon, already a place of beauty and challenge, had become a puzzle to solve. Each day brought new observations, each evening new questions. Who was this person? Why had they come to Rattlesnake Canyon? Were they a traveler seeking shelter, a student of nature, or someone with intentions unknown? Lela and Maris had no answers, yet the mystery itself was compelling. Despite their fascination, the sisters never let their curiosity override caution. They continued to strengthen their cabin, gather supplies, and maintain their routines. They understood that the canyon could be unpredictable, and even a friendly observer might become a source of risk. Their intelligence, vigilance, and careful planning allowed them to explore this new chapter without endangering themselves. The figure's presence also strengthened the bond between Lela and Maris. They relied on each other more than ever, communicating silently through gestures and shared glances. Each discovery became a joint effort, each observation a shared insight. The sisters realized that they were not just surviving in the canyon. They were learning, adapting, and growing. The canyon had become a teacher in ways they had never imagined, offering both challenges and opportunities for discovery. As winter approached fully, the canyon seemed to hold its breath. The air grew colder, the creeks slower, and the nights longer. The mysterious visitor had appeared less frequently, perhaps adapting to the shorter days or finding other paths through the hills. But the memory of their presence lingered, a reminder that the world beyond the sisters' cabin still existed, and that not all mysteries were meant to be solved quickly. By the end of the season, Lela and Maris had transformed the canyon into a place of layered awareness. They knew its sounds, its paths, and its hidden corners. They understood its moods, its patterns, and even its secrets. The mysterious visitor had introduced a new element to their lives, a puzzle that challenged them to observe more carefully, think more deeply, and act more deliberately. The canyon had become more than a refuge. It had become a living story, one that included both the sisters and the unseen figure who had entered their world. Winter in Rattlesnake Canyon had brought both beauty and tension, challenge and discovery. Lela and Maris had proven that they could adapt to new circumstances, maintain control over their environment, and navigate mysteries without fear. The canyon, with all its rugged cliffs, hidden streams, and shifting shadows, had become a place of learning, growth, and silent communication. And while the identity and intentions of the mysterious visitor remained unknown, the sisters had embraced the challenge, knowing that understanding the world around them required patience, intelligence, and an unwavering sense of observation. The stage was set for future encounters, discoveries, and challenges. The canyon had taught the sisters much about themselves, about survival, and about the subtle interplay of trust, observation, and curiosity. And as the first snows dusted the cliffs and the nights grew longer, Lela and Maris prepared for whatever the canyon might reveal next, confident in their ability to face the unknown together. Winter had fully settled over Rattlesnake Canyon. The creek ran slowly, its waters darker under the gray skies, and the wind whistled sharply through the cliffs, bending the few trees that still clung to their leaves. Snow dusted the higher rocks, and the nights were long, stretching into cold, quiet hours. For Lela and Maris, life had grown more disciplined. Every day required careful attention, checking supplies, reinforcing the cabin, and remaining aware of the patterns in the land. Yet there was an added tension in the air, a lingering reminder of the mysterious presence they had noticed in the canyon over the past months. The sisters had become expert observers. They could tell when a bird's flight suggested danger, when footprints hinted at a traveler's path, or when the wind carried unusual sounds from distant cliffs. Each day they scanned the horizon for signs of movement. Each night they listened for the softest sounds beyond the fire's warmth. The mysterious visitor had not appeared for several days, and this absence created a new kind of tension. The sisters wondered if the figure had moved on, or if it had been waiting, watching silently from the shadows, planning the next step in this quiet interaction. One morning, Lela spotted a small light in the distance along the canyon wall. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like a flicker of sunlight through the trees. She motioned for Maris to follow her, and together they moved silently toward the source. As they approached, they realized it was not a light at all, but a reflection from a small metal object someone had left carefully positioned on a flat rock. It seemed deliberate, almost like a signal. Lela picked it up, noting that it was polished and placed in a way that could only be noticed by someone who moved with careful observation. "This is intentional," Lela said softly. "Someone wants to communicate without speaking." Maris nodded, her eyes scanning the cliffs for any sign of movement. They had learned over the weeks that the canyon itself could become a form of language, with footprints, branches, and objects all serving as silent messages. Whoever had left this was intelligent, patient, and thoughtful, using the land as a tool to interact with them. That evening, the sisters decided to leave a response. They arranged a small pile of stones in a pattern that they hoped would be noticed, carefully positioning it near the creek, but visible from the cliffs. Then they retreated to the cabin and waited, watching the canyon's edges as night fell. The stars shone brightly, reflected in the creek like a mirror, and the canyon seemed to hold its breath. Hours passed and nothing appeared. Yet Lela and Maris understood that patience was part of the lesson. This was a silent dialogue, a game of observation and understanding, not of haste or recklessness. The next day brought another sign. A feather, carefully placed atop one of their stone arrangements, indicated that the mysterious visitor had seen their message and chosen to respond. It was simple, almost elegant, and required careful attention to notice. Lela and Maris exchanged a glance, a mixture of curiosity and excitement. They had been engaged in this silent communication for weeks, each interaction a small puzzle that required intelligence, patience, and respect for the canyon itself. Over the following days, the pattern continued. Stones, sticks, and natural objects were arranged with care, leaving hints and responses that only careful observation could reveal. Lela and Maris began to see the figure not as a threat, but as a partner in this unusual dialogue. They never spoke directly, never approached too closely, yet a connection formed through observation, intelligence, and mutual respect. The sisters found themselves anticipating the next sign, analyzing its meaning and responding in kind. The canyon had become a living puzzle, a stage for this quiet and clever interaction. The sisters also noticed that their own skills had grown sharper. Their awareness of the land, their patience, and their intelligence had improved dramatically. They moved more gracefully, observed more carefully, and thought more deliberately about every action. The canyon had become not just a home, but a teacher, a guide that rewarded those who respected its patterns and punished those who acted without care. Lela and Maris realized that the mysterious visitor had been a part of this lesson all along, prompting them to refine their skills and deepen their understanding of the world around them. As the days passed, the sisters began to imagine the visitor as a character in the story of the canyon. Perhaps it was someone who shared their love of the land, someone who appreciated its challenges, beauty, and subtle messages. They speculated on the person's life, their travels, and their reasons for being in the canyon. The mystery became part of the sisters' daily experience, a silent thread weaving through their routines, their observations, and their reflections. One crisp morning, the sisters decided to venture further than ever before, following a path that led to a hidden ledge overlooking the canyon floor. From this vantage point, they could see the creek winding through the cliffs, the sparse trees casting long shadows, and the patterns of the land that had become so familiar to them. As they stood there, Layla noticed a figure in the distance, moving slowly but deliberately along a hidden trail. Maris froze beside her, both sisters holding their breath. The figure paused as if acknowledging their presence, then disappeared behind the rocks. It was the first time they had seen the visitor directly, and it was enough to spark both caution and fascination. The sisters understood that this encounter was a turning point. The canyon, with all its beauty and challenge, had brought them together with someone who respected its rules, understood its language, and shared in its mystery. Lela and Maris felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing that they had navigated this season with intelligence, patience, and skill. The winter deepened, bringing longer nights and colder days. The sisters continued their routines, tending to the cabin, observing the land, and maintaining the silent dialogue with the visitor. Each day was a mixture of preparation, observation, and reflection. They had learned that life in the canyon required balance between caution and curiosity, patience and action, solitude and interaction. The mysterious visitor had become part of this balance, a reminder that even in isolation, connection and understanding were possible. By the end of the season, Layla and Maris had achieved a sense of harmony with the canyon. They had strengthened their skills, deepened their bond, and navigated challenges with intelligence and care. The visitor's presence, while still mysterious, had taught them patience, observation, and the importance of subtle communication. The sisters realized that the canyon had become a living story, with each day adding a new chapter filled with lessons, discoveries, and reflections. As the first signs of spring approached, the canyon began to change once more. The creek flowed more freely, the trees regained their leaves, and the air carried the scent of new life. Layla and Maris reflected on the winter that had passed, the mysteries they had encountered, and the lessons they had learned. The canyon had tested them, challenged them, and ultimately strengthened them. The mysterious visitor had been a part of this journey, teaching them that intelligence, patience, and respect for the natural world could create connections even without words. The sisters knew that the story of Rattlesnake Canyon was far from over. They had survived the harshest winter yet, learned to navigate mysteries, and discovered the value of careful observation and thoughtful action. The canyon would continue to offer challenges, beauty, and lessons, and Lala and Maris were ready to face whatever came next. They had become part of the canyon itself, inseparable from its cliffs, streams, and shadows, and they knew that their lives would continue to unfold in harmony with the land they called home. In the years that followed, the story of the sisters in Rattlesnake Canyon became a legend among travelers and locals. People spoke of two women living in the wilds, surviving with skill and intelligence, and interacting mysteriously with the land in ways few could understand. The sisters' story was remembered not for conflict or danger, but for their cleverness, patience, and ability to navigate a world both beautiful and challenging. They had transformed the canyon into a place of learning, connection, and reflection, leaving a legacy that endured long after their time there. Layla and Maris had discovered that true strength was not just physical, it was intelligence, observation, patience, and understanding. Rattlesnake Canyon had tested them, guided them, and ultimately shaped them into guardians of its secrets and stories. And as the sun set behind the cliffs, casting golden light across the creek and rocks, the sisters stood together, confident in their place in the canyon and ready for the mysteries that the future would bring.